Well, here at the Aussie Wire, we've been following and helping to tell the stories of a number of different doctors who, each in their own way, are fighting different but similar fights against suspension or various other forms of censure because of the stand that they took during the COVID crisis. Well, today we get to talk to the OG. He was the very first one to be suspended by AHPRA, and well, you know what? I'm not going to tell his story for him. Dr. Paul Oosterhuis, thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Wonderful to be here, Topher.
Now, Paul, you've been a busy man. You managed to get yourself deregistered or have your license suspended before anybody else. You also managed to have your very first interview basically destroy the social media account of the person who interviewed you. So we're going to have to be really careful here. I don't want the Aussie Wire to just get completely gutted and kicked off YouTube. However, we do also need to speak the truth. So, Doctor, there's a lot of people that don't know your story. You've told your story and you're a regular on the No Goat Show, which is, of course, Cafe Lockdown, Michael Gray Griffith and the team there that do a wonderful job. You've told your story there, but for those that don't know, tell us what happened with this suspension and what you did in return.
Well, I'm a senior specialist in anaesthesia and practiced in anaesthesia and critical care for 32 years. And I was highly critical of what was going on, the lockdowns, the mandates. I saw the harm being done from them. I understood very early on that you could treat COVID. Vitamin D, zinc, hydroxy.
And other things.
Hydroxy and ivy, yeah. And I felt I had an ethical responsibility
sure.
to tell the world, to alleviate fear, keep people out of hospital. As a critical care specialist, it was my job to if I could simply prevent people from getting into hospital, getting into intensive care and dying. That's my job. I've been doing that for 32 years. So I was horrified at what was happening in the healthcare system. I was horrified about the COVID policies, the lack of basis for lockdowns, for masks. I lived, ate, and slept that. So, in 2021, I got immediate action powers for public protection because I was saying these things. But the truth is, I think it was a tweet to Brad Hazard, the health minister, on the day that 24,000 school kids were being rounded up at Pacer Arena and injected with the experimental gene jab, synthetic gene jab. And I said, I put up a chart of the infection fatality rate by age and said, look, in this age group, times 24,000 times 0.0016%.
Yeah.
You would expect 0 kids to die. And if you have even one death, you have a signal of harm and you should be watching. 2 hours later, I became an immediate threat to public health or really the political health of one health minister.
Yeah.
So I had a suspension hearing on the 3rd of September 2021. I was told not to turn up by Serene Kahafale, provided feedback, said it's a kangaroo court, don't go. But I went there because I wanted to put it on the public record. I didn't want them to have a chance to say, we didn't know. In my hearing, I laid out that they had an obligation to provide informed consent, that there were no long-term safety studies, that this was a novel technology that had skipped the normal testing phases for a gene therapy, and that it was in fact a gene therapy, not a vaccine.
All of which is well established. I mean, none of that is controversial if you've actually paid any attention to the data that we have.
It was highly controversial in 2021 to be saying the things I said, and I was duly suspended. And that's where my first interview was Maria Z, not long after it, and that's where I got into. She said, just before we went on, she said, "Look, you can't say IV. I still can't say it. IV.
Yeah, that's right.
IV,
Oxy,
hydroxy,
all those things.
But the thing, or even natural immunity. Unfortunately, I trashed her Instagram channel that night.
Which is a shame because she does good work, and
She's back.
she
She
is
got
back.
over
Yes,
it.
she is. Yeah.
So the next step was that I became activated because they targeted me. I was the first doctor that they targeted it, and I'm a member of the senior staff. I knew the president of the medical council. I'd worked with him for 20 years. So I could have been on the medical council board myself. And so, I didn't take it lightly. And so in February, because I went to protests, I went down to Melbourne without a mask, walking around Tullamarine Airport, expecting to be crash tackled at any moment because I was actually standing up without a mask. I could.
Oh dear! Don't you know that the virus is at that height? If you sit down without a mask, it's fine, but the minute you stand up, you're going to get hit, man. It's dangerous.
There was a guy. There were some travellers in full Tyvek suits with respirators, and I took a picture of them, but I kicked myself that I didn't do a selfie. It would have been classic. I was engaged. I went to Epic Camp. I was one of the very, very few doctors in that crowd of 500,000 people marching on at the front of. But it was a great film. Anyway, so in February, as a result of the people I met, I sued the Medical Council of New South Wales in the Supreme Court.
Right.
And I did it without a lawyer, just representing myself, with a little bit of help from my friends explaining what the legal arguments were.
You do realise the truism that he who represents himself in court has a fool for a client. You've heard that before, haven't you?
Yes. Yeah, well, it's true. Yet, as I went on, I became more and more confident that actually what they had done was unlawful, and that I wanted to argue that. And after about 12 directions hearings, and with a bit of luck from Russell Pridgeon's decision in the Supreme Court of Appeal in New South Wales, they went hot, and the Health Commission dropped their complaint, and my suspension was lifted.
Wow.
So that was that. So I was the first doctor, I believe, in Australia to be suspended for defying the gag orders of AHPRA. And I was the first doctor to be unsuspended through the action in the courts.
But of course, by doing it that way, by dropping the suspension prior, if I've misunderstood the story, correct me, but it never got to the point where a court found in your favour. It got to the point where they dropped the matter. And so therefore they've avoided you setting a precedent that could have helped others.
I wanted a precedent. I desperately wanted a precedent. That was really the goal. It wasn't that I wanted to rush back to practice because I had there were still mandates hanging over me.
Yeah, right.
I was seeing that my colleagues were doing harm and behaving unethically. And I as much as I loved my years of practice, my dad often asked, why did you go into anaesthetics? And to me, it was the best job in the world because I could. It was dramatic. It was life and death. And I could make an immediate difference to people's lives. I could bring them back from the brink. I could alleviate their pain. It was a great honor to do it, but I couldn't do it in the craziness of what had happened.
Well, Dr. Paul Oosterhuis, thank you so much for bringing us up to date on that part of your story. There is, of course, so much more going on with you, and we've agreed that sometime next week I'm going to do a deep dive with you. We're going to have to publish that on Rumble and other places where we can just speak freely. We can talk for as long as it takes because that is only just one very small part of your story. There's so much more to it. There's so much more to discuss about what you knew early on when it came to early treatments, all the way through to what we know now and where all of that is going. So, for the moment, let's not call this the end. Let's call this a pause in our discussion. Dr. Paul Oosterhuis, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, both.